In my attic, I found letters and letters and letters, and some old report cards, and a Sunday school attendance card, and some clothing. I began to read because I wanted to find out who was she. And as I read, I discovered I was moved by the depth of her journey, by the beauty of her writing and those who wrote letters to her, and the journey of faith and love that her short life encompassed. So I thought, what can I do with these? Well, she and the family were closely associated with Elizabethtown College, and I thought, the archives, that's where they belong. I kept a few for my children, but I also decided I needed to write out the story before I donated the letters. So I began to read and write. And I was finding that other people were interested in her too. So what I wound up doing was writing Fianna's story, which is out there in the lobby. And this is her story. What did I do? There. Okay. All right. This was her family. A rather large family. Mother Fianna, she was named after her mother. Father George. It was a blended family. Both Fianna and George had been married before and brought children into their union. Their spouses had died. So Mother Fianna's children were the three on the left, and Father George had the crew on the right, and the ones in the middle, Rufus, William, and Fianna, were the children that they had together. Fianna was the second youngest in this family. They lived on a farm in southern Lebanon County, surrounded by uncles and aunts, and lots of other family farms there. So I don't know too much about her childhood, but I can make some guesses. I think she was probably partly raised by her older sisters. I think she had chores on the farm. There were lots of relatives around. You know, I think she probably had a lot of hand-me-down clothing. What do you think? School days. Her older siblings would have taken her by hand and taken her to school. And I have these report cards. I don't know if you can see it clearly there, but for the grade that she got in deportment, she's 6 years old, remember? And she got 95 in deportment, which I think is pretty good for a 6-year-old. Now, on the right, I have something called a head marks card, and I had to do a little research to figure out what that was. But a head marks is the head student, the one who is the top of the class for a certain period of time. And the school teacher of the one-room school is the one who gives that out at her choice, at her choosing. I also inherited some homework that they kept. Penmanship book, and that book is on the table out in the lobby. She loved writing, and as you can see, repeated the same lines over and over again and repeated them beautifully. And I haven't tried to figure out whether that math is correct or not, but if anybody wants to, you probably can do that. So, home, family, school, and church. They belong to the German Baptist Brethren. We're rooted in it for generations. And Father George and his brother Christian were ministers there. This is a picture of the Bucher Meeting House where she attended. It has a cemetery behind it where her father George is buried with his first wife. And they were very dedicated to church. Church and family, family and church were all intermingling. When she was 9 years old, something really tremendous happened in her life. And this is the story. Her father went to Lancaster for a church meeting. And he learned there that there was no German Baptist church south of Lancaster City, although there were some people who belonged to the denomination who lived in the southern part of Lancaster County. He decided he was called to change that. So he went home and he informed or maybe discussed with his family that they were going to move. He sold the family farm, left all that cluster of relatives in southern Lebanon County, and moved in March, loading all their possessions up, and as the story goes, in a Conestoga wagon. And it took 2 days to go over muddy roads to the new farm that he had bought, which was near Mechanic Grove. And he and his family started the Mechanic Grove Church of the Brethren, which is still thriving and is very strong. Within a year, they had a regular worship, and Fianna joined the church there at 10 years old. She was one of the first two people to be baptized and become a church member. By age 17, she was Sunday school secretary. And this book that you see in the picture is out on the table there. You're welcome to take a little extra look at it. They kept very close, careful records, and you can also see her beautiful handwriting, right? You notice who had the prayer on that day. It was Rufus Booker, whose room we are standing in, named after him. Mentioned the offering, the persons present. Sometimes they even named the weather that they had on that particular Sunday. Very detailed records there. So church was the heart of her childhood, but I think even more the faith that she grew, being part of her family and community, supported her throughout her life and through the hardships that came in her life. So what was the next stage of her life? Well, Father George believed in education, for girls too. And he wanted all his children to go to school if they could. Some of them went to Bridgewater because Elizabethtown had not started yet, but he was one of the early supporters of this college. And as you may know, Rufus was in the first class of Elizabethtown College. And a few years later, Fianna followed also. I inherited her college bill. You see how much it costs for a term? I won't make any comments, but the students who are sitting in the back there might be interested. She did get a $4.80 discount for being in a minister's family. One of the things that I appreciated was the letters that she wrote home from college. And these 3 quotes that I have on the slide show a progression throughout the year. The first one, written in November, says, "We are right in the midst of examinations. I'm one day nearer home." Little homesickness there, maybe. In January, she felt differently. "I get hot sometimes when I see how much I would like to learn till spring." And by March, she was writing about how much she will miss the girls, talking in the dormitories together. And she also taught class when the teacher was ill. So she really immersed herself in learning. That wasn't all that happened to her that year, though. Samuel Meyer entered her life in a really big way. They were both students at the college, and I think they had known each other before because they were both Brethren ministers' children, and he lived in northern Lebanon County, where his roots were. They shared classes, probably. Most certainly, they shared a love of poetry because I found some poems that they both read. And Longfellow was a favorite at that time, widely adored by the public everywhere. But I have a postcard that Samuel wrote to Fianna, and he signed it with their own private name, Hiawatha. Samuel was at school for that year with her. When her year was finished, he went back to teaching school, and then he returned to Elizabethtown for one more year. He graduated twice with a diploma. They didn't have degrees at that point. And a few months after, or a few weeks, sorry, after he graduated, they married. This is their wedding picture, but I want you to note what it says on the right with that picture of a snippet of cloth. Mama's wedding and burying dress. They had 5 years together. At that point, they were engaged in beginning a new family, having children, setting up housekeeping. They lived close to his family, so she lived 60 miles from her family, which was a really strong family unit. Here are the children. Ammon is the baby there, sitting in that chair, and then when he's a little older, he has Leah as a sister. And I want to tell you that I have that dress that you see the picture of on the table out there, made over a century ago. Family and farm and children kept her very busy. Samuel, meanwhile, worked at the First National Bank in Fredericksburg, and I did a little research and found that picture. I also found that it was only 3 years old when he got the job there, and that his father and grandfather happened to be bank directors. I'm not going to say there's a connection, but that is his cashier's stool. He worked there for a number of years, and then he returned to teaching. So what was their life like? I had a lot of letters that went back and forth from Quarryville area, her family there, and Fianna. And these are some quotations that tell something about her life. The family supported them any way they could. They gave them some crabapple jelly, I found, and some smoked meat. And she wished that Mother could hear all the compliments about Ammon's coat. And then she goes on and says, we got a secondhand stove for $8. We want to keep warm. In 1913, she wrote the third quotation there, and tells me that that's when the phones came through. It doesn't feel as though I'm so far from home if I can take down the receiver and talk. We know what that's like. We do it all the time, but it does make a difference, doesn't it? Rather than just hearing seeing people's handwriting. Church continued to be active, an active center to their lives. And she wrote one letter about a very full day. It wasn't just Sunday morning service and Sunday afternoon Sunday school, but it was a whole weekend of special services in which people came from different congregations and had a meeting together. And she wrote, well, we had our Sunday school meeting in the Union House yesterday. 6 persons were here for supper, and then they had people come for the night too. Our beds were filled with strangers, and we slept on the floor. And she goes on and says, I slept only a few hours. It was late and I was thinking too much. Do you wonder that I'm tired? But we enjoyed their visit very much. So this was the shape of their first few years of marriage. It was rich, it was full, and it was definitely a looking forward to what would be unfolding in the future. Unfortunately, sad times came. They had another baby who did not thrive. The postcard on the left says, was sent to Diana's parents, notifying them of the birth of baby Rufus. I arrived on a very cold day at 9:30. My name is Rufus Booker Meyer. But unfortunately, a month later, she was writing to her parents, "Dear home folks, we have a very sick baby. We look to a higher power." Babies did die much more than they do now. And she wrote that, and 48 hours later, he died. What really touches me about this is the next quotation was written after the burial of the baby and after life was trying to return to normal. And she's not feeling well herself. But she says that Ammon, who remember is like 2.5 now, Ammon came and said, "I can't find baby Rufus, Mama. Help me find baby Rufus." And she said in her letter, "I tried to explain. He went away and came back and said, 'Mama, find baby Rufus for me.' That was too much for me." Unfortunately, the hard times continued because Diana is not well, and the doctors don't know what's going on with her. Now, this is a picture of her one half-sister who lived in Lancaster, not married, worked as a housekeeper for some established Lancaster families. And Sister Leah wrote to her, "I want to give you some good advice. Do what the doctor tells you to. Don't clean house. And if you do get better and feel able to, use your strength for something else. And I'll come and clean for you. And Samuel and I will have a contest to see who's stronger at shaking out rugs." There was a lot of big sister protection there, I think. Her sister Mary Habecker, Marian Ferris, her husband lived near Quarryville, and she was a very important big sister to her too. And she wrote also saying, "Don't be discouraged. If things aren't taken care of as you would like, don't let these things pull you down." And then wistfully, "If only I was closer, I would gladly help you out." There's a picture of Sister Mary and husband Ferris Habecker. Mary wrote on another occasion about the Brethren anointing service. And she wrote very specifically about James V. She said, "It's a commandment that's usually not used until a person is dying, but the scripture doesn't say that. The scripture says, if you're sick, call on the elders." Well, I looked up what James V said, and James 5:14 says, "Is any among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them in the name of the Lord." Diana took her sister's advice. They had a service, and she wrote back to her sister, "We had a beautiful service last evening. Brothers Wenger and Fouts were here. I never felt nearer heaven in my life. I'm stronger today, but I am demanding too much of my strength. I'm getting Leah's things ready and sending lots of clothes. Baby Leah, whom Diana wasn't strong enough to lift anymore, lived with Sister Mary for almost 4 years. She stayed there until after her mother died and her father got his home reorganized again. But it was very painful to give up her baby. We give our darling girl into your hands for an indefinite time. Now, I included a note there that she wrote in a letter to her parents. Whatever you do, don't go to Europe now. Anybody know why? Why did she say that? The letter was written August 12th, 1914. I see some people nodding. Well, I did some research and I found out what their local newspaper said in its front page headlines on August 12th, 1914. Germans at the heart of Belgium. Big Germany army hurled at France near Alsace. British warned the U.S. of mines at sea. It was the beginning of World War I. Now, her parents were not going to Europe, but they were going on a traveling preaching trip. And this was an expression of her horror at what she was reading about in the newspaper. Finally, she saw a hospital doctor, someone with more training, Dr. Weiss, who worked out of the hospital in Lebanon. And he did something that nobody had done before. I'm going to read what she wrote. He examined my lungs with some kind of instrument, which he put on my bare chest and had tubes to his ears. He could plainly tell by my breathing where the problem lay. He didn't give me a bit of medicine, he just gave me advice. She had never been examined with a stethoscope before. And unfortunately, what he said to her was, this is tuberculosis. And the advice that he had for her was that she should go to a sanatorium where she could be cared for more intensively than being at home. Well, what is TB? We all know, we've heard the name, but we don't have it around us very much. And so it's like it's out there somewhere. Well, it wasn't out there in 1914, I assure you. It is still very active around the world. In 2015, 1.5 million people died from tuberculosis. It is curable today, but there is a very complicated antibiotic treatment over many months that's needed to cure it. And there is no really good vaccine. So it's still a big danger in the world. But Diana lived in a time before antibiotics. There was no cure. There were many useless treatments. In fact, in the 1800s, George Bernard Shaw, I discovered in my research, said that TB treatment is a commercial system of quackery and poison. In other words, anything you do as treatment is worse than doing nothing practically. Now, it may have been less common in rural Pennsylvania than it was in the big cities of New York and Philadelphia. There it was very common, but it could also live in your body dormant for a long time. So nobody knew who had it and who didn't, but it was really, really feared. Hospitals might refuse to accept somebody who was thought to have TB because they thought it might spread. It was contagious. The best treatment available was to let the body, to care for one's body and to let it be as strong as it can, and maybe it would fight off the infection. Some people did survive. After Thanksgiving in 1914, Diana and Ammon and Samuel took the train from Lebanon to Allentown, switched trains to Whitehaven, and went to Whitehaven Tuberculosis Sanatorium. These are pictures from postcards, and I did a little research on the sanatorium to find out what it was like. It was built on purpose as a sanatorium for TB patients. Most of the staff had survived it. It was in the heights of the Pocono Mountains, where they would get lots of fresh air, away from the cities, away from people. It had been built by some people from the Philadelphia hospitals areas. If you notice on the right-hand picture, Rose Cottage, it's called a cottage, looks like, I don't know what it looks like, a dormitory maybe, and you see all those windows jutting out. Those windows were always kept open, and people slept on those kinds of open balconies because one of the things that you needed to have was fresh air. We're talking December, January, and February, and that's where they slept. So what was the Whitehaven treatment? Well, I learned about Dr. Lawrence Flick, who was an expert, a researcher on TB, a survivor of TB, worked with Philadelphia hospitals. The household companion, which I located, was the sort of thing that the housewife and the home would have in it. It contained all different kinds of things, but this one contained his recipe for caring for someone with TB. What do you think of that? So when she got to Whitehaven, her diet was 3 quarts of milk, 8 raw eggs, and 1 normal meal each day. She slept out with the windows open on the balcony, and she rested all the time. So how did it work? Not too well. She got sick from all the milk and the eggs, which I get sick too, I think. But she threw up a lot. She lost weight. Eventually, one of the doctors said to her, you think you could, we'll cut back the amount of milk you're getting and the number of raw eggs, and we'll give you a little extra food, real food. And that seemed to help. Her stomach wasn't so upset all the time, but she didn't really get better. I love the center part about the sleeping on the balconies. I was disturbed a little by snow coming in on my face. Now, she had heavy quilts, so she wasn't cold really, but, it tickled her face to have snowflakes falling on it. And her pillow was all snowy. There was no activities director. There was nothing provided for them to do. There's several hundred patients just kind of sat around or lay around all day. This is certainly a lazy life, but it really wasn't helping her. Now, it may have helped some of the people from the big cities to be stronger. They were resting, they did have fresh air, but it was not doing anything for Diana, and life there was hard for her. She got used to the coughing, but she was different. She read her Bible a lot, and she dressed differently. She dressed like a plain German Baptist Brethren woman would dress. And they'd never seen anybody like that before. They thought she was a real Quakeress. And they asked about her caps. Why is she wearing, we call them a covering. Why was she wearing that all the time? Now, she also discovered that even though they were supposed to be limited in what they were going to be eating, family coming to visit would bring extra food. Or send it. And so she asked for some things too. I'm hungry for some of the strawberry preserves we made. some cocoa, some pretzels. Bring me something good to eat. She also just didn't have anything to do. And you notice that some of the people had some books, and she asked, do you think it would hurt me to read white slave traffic? Instead of her reading white slave traffic, they decided to send her some church magazines, some local newspapers, some books. I suspect she was making a joke there. She has a sense of humor. But she was a long way from home, and it was a huge job for folks to come and visit her. Samuel came a number of times. Her sister Mary came and brought little Leah along, and that was a real gift to see her little girl, see how much she'd grown. And her parents came one time. This is the entrance to Whitehaven Sanatorium. And she wrote in a letter to one of her siblings how good it was to have her parents there. They got some coffee. The staff seemed to appreciate that they traveled so far to see their daughter. And her mother apparently brought some caps that she'd knitted because they had to sleep out in this balcony, and not all of them had caps like she did. And she handed them around some of the other patients. And I can picture George Bucher, her father, going from room to room and shaking hands with people and asking them their names and where they're from and how they're doing. Just being the welcoming kind of a presence that he was. Her neighbor said, "Can your father write?" Well, he didn't get past 8th grade, but he did write a lot. And he read a lot too. So there we are. She's living there. The hardest thing is missing her children and Samuel. And here I have a couple of quotations from postcards she sent. The postcard on the left, a Happy New Year. The other side of it says, Dear Ammon. I guess this is Ammon and Leah on this card. Don't you think so? And she missed her daughter's birthday on January 20th. To my little Dolly, may you have many more happy birthdays, and may you live to be a good little woman. She did. She was my aunt, so I know. The center of her life continued to be her faith. She missed her church community. She said, Sunday's like any other day, unless we try to make it different. She also said, you have no idea how little some people think of using God's name in vain. And she missed Bible study. One thing that she did do was ask the church, her home congregation, for prayer. And Samuel wrote her a letter telling how the church prayed for her and how that was shared. He said, your letter was touchingly given by Brother Wenger. He could hardly read it, and I guess he tried to make an impression. There were many who could not keep back the tears. In her interactions with other people, having a gentle upbringing where faith was an important part of it helped her, but it also presented her with some challenges. Some of the patients said she should make it worse than it is so that she'd get attention because they felt she was being neglected. And then her roommate, who didn't get those extra little meals, was jealous. And she just stared at her and said nasty things to her about the fact that she was getting a little extra food. And then there was a stolen toast story, which I am going to dip into the book I've read and read to you because it's priceless. Yesterday morning, while taking my milk, I said to my roommate, I wish I had a piece of toast to eat with this. Before I knew it, she went out into the kitchen and stole 2 pieces of toast with butter and brought them to me. Well, I didn't know what to do. My conscience told me it was wrong to eat it as she had stolen it, and I knew I would offend her if I didn't eat it. After a while, I said I couldn't do it. She asked why, and I said my conscience won't let me. She started to scold me and call me a foolish thing. I let her talk, but I resolved in my heart not to take it. I said, maybe the Lord will let me get well on my conscience, even if I don't have so much in my stomach. After a while, she said, of course, it is stealing. I don't think she'll do that again. It was a little thing, but I'm sure that toast would have been hard to digest had I eaten it. There are many chances to let your light shine in a place like this. I think that's what she found to be true. Samuel was going through his own dark night. He came to visit her one time, walked up the mountain behind, covered with snow, and it looked about like this, I think, because they were really in an isolated spot high in the mountains. And he knelt in the snow and prayed for her to recover. But Diana was not to recover. On February 12th, Samuel wrote the letter telling her family that he was told she was not going to recover. She cannot live. And she wasn't supposed to be told that. That was the policy in those times. So he stayed with her all that day, but he wasn't allowed to stay with her overnight. And he went down the hill to where he had a room. And he said, Diana was over on the hill. Ammon was at home. Baby Leah was with Aunt Mary. Baby Rufus was in heaven, and I was all alone with that sad news heavy on my heart and nobody to tell it to. Now, a couple of days later, he got another letter from her, and he's hoping that that's not going to be the way it really turns out. He says, doctors can be liars too. They don't know everything, is what he was expressing. The newspaper clipping there talks about her journey home. And it says that she was brought home on a cot to Lebanon. This is the Lebanon newspaper. And although I did a lot of research, I couldn't figure out which of the newspapers had it, which of those Lebanon newspapers had it. But she traveled on a cot in the baggage section. And her appearance stretched out on a cot attracted considerable attention at the station, and much sympathy for her condition was expressed, even if people didn't know who she was. The doctors had recommended she come home to die. She could be cared for better there. She could be surrounded by family. Diana lived 6 weeks after she returned home. Her sister Leah, who worked in Lancaster as a housekeeper, left her job and came and took care of her. She stayed with Samuel and Ammon for several months, actually. And Ammon was there, of course. Baby Leah and Sister Mary came to visit. There were many visitors, but she kept on going downhill. There was basically nothing that could be done for her. She was in pain and she was bedfast. Now I have two slides of quotations from the letters that were written to another sister. Remember, this is a big family, Sister Annie. And Sister Annie lived in Virginia and was unable to come to see her sister or even to come for the funeral. So after Diana died, she wrote to Samuel and to Leah, who were there, and said, write and tell me all about it. What was it like to journey with her? What was it like when she died? I want to know. And they wrote long letters, 8, 10-page letters, writing, spelling out everything. And it was probably good for them to write it too. And the letters were kept, and I have a copy of them. She was anointed again. This is Sister Leah writing to Annie. And she said, I am submissive to his will. Samuel wrote and said how they didn't talk about her dying until she had given up all hope. But then they had some good conversations. Then he and Diana could talk about the future for the children, the future for Samuel, what life was going to be like as they went forward through the years. The doctor, Sister Leah wrote, Dr. Wise was tending her. And he had visited her and she said, I'm sorry I'm still here. I was hoping I'd be gone by now. He was teary-eyed and he felt so bad that nothing could be done for her. Samuel wrote in his letter to Annie, if I had to live life over, I would surely marry the same sweetheart. I would do the same things over only if I had more wisdom. I would likely here and there drop in an extra kind word and deed. Inevitable feelings of regret for not doing as much as he could. And Sister Leah wrote, it was hard to be brave and bear up, but I was glad I could be there. It's the first time I was at a deathbed. And she wrote at the end of that page, as long as memory lasts, we shall remember the beautiful words spoken. I am going to my beautiful heavenly home. I am so happy. Now, I learned by doing a little research that it was a custom in those days that when someone was dying, they often had someone else sitting there with them to write down everything that they said. And they did that for Diana. She died on April 11th, 1915. Her family was there. And this is the page on which her final words are written. I'm going home. I'm so happy. I want to just read something that is on another sheet of that. And Diana says, I'm going to my beautiful heavenly home. Samuel responds, we will come sometime. And she said, I will wait for you inside the gates. You see there the depth of faith that she had in what she had been taught, and it sustained her throughout her life. The community gathered. Now the Buchers and the Meyers were both big families, and they knew a lot of people. There was the college community, of course, and I think at that time, I.N.H. Bean was still the president here, which was her brother-in-law. And there was also the Quarryville Circle. There was the Southern Lebanon County circles. Father George put a notice in the Quarryville Sun the newspaper there saying, if you want to come to this funeral, this is how you do it. This is the train to take. Someone will meet you in Lebanon and you can come. So it was an enormous funeral. In fact, one of the newspaper articles that I found said it was one of the largest circles or largest services held in the area. 400 people dined after the service, and 125 horses were fed. This is the Union Meeting House where her funeral was held. It was one of the churches where the congregation met, and it was probably one of the largest ones. So not everybody could get in the building, though, anyway. There had been a private ceremony first, then the burial, and then this large public one. And you can see the invitation on the slide to the private one at the home. And then Samuel said that he asked the brethren to use Laban's words as a text. The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent from another. And if you notice, the first point there that they spoke on was the Lord watching. And he says, that is my greatest need. I need the Lord's care as I move forward. After the funeral was over and he went home, he said wisely, now the worst is yet to come. He wrote in a letter to his brother that when the branch was broken from the tree, meaning Rufus's death, baby Rufus, that was hard. But when the tree trunk was split in two, it was a wound beyond repair in this life. He felt that the children gave him something to live for. He had Ammon at home and he cared for Ammon. His mother took care of Ammon during the day. There was also a housekeeper there for sometimes. But he lived for them. He also wrote and said that there were those people that he thought were just acquaintances, and he got letters from them that said they were real friends. He also turned to poetry again. Longfellow had lost a child and his wife, and some of his poems rose out of that, I discovered in my research. So he read poetry. I began not knowing this woman. All I knew about her was that my father remembered faintly that she had dark hair and she was slender. Well, she was only 28. We never really talked about her that much, but now I know her. And I'm grateful. And I'm also glad to share her story with you. I haven't emphasized so much the research I did, but you probably guessed throughout that there was more than was in the pictures themselves. So I'm finished with what I had to offer, and I invite you to ask questions. Yes, Ken.
Would baby Leah have lived with Aunt Mary and Uncle Ferris Habecker in the 1940s and 50s? I remember baby Leah.
No, she would not have lived with him, but, okay, yes. Baby Leah, how long did she stay with Sister Mary and her husband down there? She lived with them full time until she was 4 years old. And then she came back home to live with Samuel. And however, that was always her second home. When she grew up and became a teacher, which she did, in summer vacation, she would spend a lot of time with the Habeckers, with Sister Leah. You could easily remember her from the 40s and 50s. Any other questions? Yes.
Was she in the sanatorium?
She was in the sanatorium for 2.5 months. And she just went steadily downhill. Yeah.
Just a comment.
Mhm.
Our daughter was the TV specialist for the University of Pittsburgh. And she tells us the biggest problem today is that people have TB, that they feel like they're getting better, that they refuse to continue their medicine, and it comes back worse. And that there's still many patients.
I think there are patients in the United States as well as abroad, but it isn't as common as it was. And the comment was about the fact that people feel better and therefore quit taking their medicine. I hope that isn't too common. Yes, Marty, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, the first postcard, I think, when they first got married, it looked like it just had her name and Elizabethtown, and that was sufficient to get it to her.
Marty, yes, the address that just had her name and Elizabethtown was sufficient to get it to her. Boy, have times changed. Yes, Dave.
Well, I had left the sanatorium and went back home. Any idea how the family managed the contagious piece?
Yeah, the question is about how did they handle the contagious piece, because they were caring for her very closely. And Leah did write a letter about that. Her sister Leah, who was doing a lot of caring for her, she talked about how we tried to wash everything we used when she was coughing and just, spewing up. They would throw the handkerchiefs out. They tried to do a lot of washing. I don't think they have the kind of masks we have today. The other thing is that there are different degrees of how contagious something is. And tuberculosis is not COVID. So it didn't spread quite that fast and easily. But you didn't know if you had it sometimes for a long time. So we don't know when she was exposed, how long it was inactive in her body. Yeah, so they did the best they could. And as far as I know, nobody else in the family got TB. Anybody else? Yes.
Did she speak any German and if not, and stop speaking German?
I don't know exactly. Her mother, it is said, didn't write to them very often because she was uncomfortable with it writing in English. So, and I know that both she and Samuel knew German. In fact, I had to get a translator because a couple of their letters had a few sentences in German in them. So I had somebody, and I don't know exactly when the transition happened, but their generation did at least know it well enough to write. In the one letter that I have, Samuel wrote to her while she was visiting her family. And he said, well, I really miss you, et cetera, but I could make the butter, do the churning, and I could make the butter. But I do need to know something. Do you put butter color in or do you put Paris green in? And I didn't know what, that was, but he had a German phrase there and I sent it off to the man who knew about Pennsylvania Dutch and German. And he said, do you know that Paris green is a poison? He was making a joke. And the joke would have gone completely over my head if I wouldn't have consulted somebody else. Anybody else? Yes, Dan.
First of all, thank you very much for sharing.
Yeah.
In the archives, or in any of the other stories, were you able to get a sense of how Samuel survived and cared for the children?
Right.
He remarried?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do know that part of the story. He remarried within 2 years. He did write in one letter that if someone he wrote in a letter to one of his brothers, if someone who's a widower remarries, they say they've forgotten their first wife. I want you to know I will never forget Diana. But he did remarry. He married a woman named Elizabeth, whom I knew as Grandma, and they had 6 children. And he is buried opposite the Union House Church, which I showed you, between Diana and Elizabeth. Other questions? Yes.
When did you start your research? And how long did it take you to finish?
Boy, that's a good question, Roger. I think I started the research probably, the book was published in 2020. I probably started the research, 6, 8 years before that, by opening the box in the attic, bringing it down to my table and getting overwhelmed. And then I put the letters in order, and I tried to read them in order so I could get that kind of sense. And then questions just rose as I came along. I went to the Southern Lancaster County Historical Society, the Lebanon County Historical Society, the Lancaster County Historical Society. I came here and I did some research here. I looked at things, talked to Jeff Bach. I also did a lot of online work because it was the easiest. I could look up and see what Fredericksburg looked like and what that bank looked like when it was first built. So the research was intermingled with writing the story. But it did take 6 or 8 years, and I have to say I did not work on it constantly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What prompted you to decide to bring the box down and begin to look into it?
Well, I don't know. I suppose those things on the shelves, the question was, why did I open the box and bring it downstairs? Well, at some point I was going to have to open it and look at it. And it was probably a winter afternoon and I wasn't sure what to do with myself. And I didn't have any gardening to do, which I usually do when I don't know what to do with myself. And I brought it down and opened it, and then I was hooked. One more question, Tam.
How did you get the box?
How did I get it? The box, I think, was saved by Samuel probably, and some probably by Leah and Mary and other family members, and it was given to my father. So I had a number of boxes of family history stuff that when my parents left their home, they came to my attic. And there they sat for 10 years at least. Is that familiar to anybody? I thought so. I don't know how we're doing for time, but any more questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that there was very little talk about in your family. Was that related to the stigma that was often associated with TB, or was it just that the whole situation was so traumatic?
I think it was more that the question was, why wasn't it talked about in my family? Well, my father was 3.5 when she died. And I think that probably it was a time just filled with grief. And then he was the older one by, let me just think, at least 6 years from the next, he and Leah were older, but he was older. And then he had a brother, Nathan, and he was 6 years younger. And this was from Elizabeth, the second wife. So he felt always, I think, a little bit separate. And this was a private grief. I will share with you that when my father was dying, he told me what his mother said when she was dying. I'd never heard that before, but she said to Samuel, "I will wait for you and Ammon inside the gates." And I thought, yeah, that's been a promise to him that he has sort of kept inside himself and not talked about all these years. Any last question? This is it, folks. There are books and there are 2 tables full of artifacts out on the table. I mean, on the right when you go out there. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for that presentation. And do take time to look at the items on the tables and to take notice of the books. I read Viana's story last winter and enjoyed it very much. I'll add the fact that there is an additional artifact in the Bowers Gallery. The exhibit about the Love Feast includes a table that was transported by George and Viana Bucher from Lebanon County to southern Lancaster County. And there's a small description on the, I should say, the back side, the side of the table that you'll see if you're walking this way towards the parking lot. So if you have never looked at that table carefully, that made that trip with their family at that time. As we wrap our time this evening, very quickly, a couple of announcements about upcoming events. This Saturday, just 2 days from now, join us here at the Young Center at 9 in the morning through 3 in the afternoon for symposium, What Does It Mean to Be Church? Anabaptist and Pietist Perspectives, co-led by Tony Walsh, who is here this evening from Ireland, Sam Funkhouser from Rockingham County, Virginia, and our own Jeff Bach, Director Emeritus of the Young Center. And then about 1 month from now, on Monday, October 21st, join us not here, but in Leffler Chapel for a concert celebrating the music of Ephrata with the Ephrata Cloister Chorus. The program begins at 7 p.m. with a presentation by Elizabethtown's archivist Rachel Grove-Warbaugh on the extensive conservation work that was completed in 2023 on 2 rare 18th century Ephrata music manuscripts that are housed here in our archives. Following that presentation, the Ephrata Cloister Chorus will perform pieces composed at Ephrata, along with music composed at the Lidditz Moravian community, selections from the Shaker community in Mount Lebanon, New York, African American spirituals, and more. It's Monday, October 21, 7 p.m. at Leffler Chapel. Thanks this evening for all of you being here, and safe travels as you return home.